Okay, let's get going. This is a panel of about 45 minutes, and then we're going to move to a coffee break and a group hug to warm up. So this one panel is about Newsroom strategies for the social web. So we've had a lot today about how these platforms are changing the way that newsrooms are putting out content, but we wanted to get some people to discuss what does that mean for how you manage your newsroom? What does this do in terms of your newsroom setup? So Ken Romano is here from the Associated Press. He's going to moderate the panel, and he's joined by Laura Amico, Justin Back, Scott Klein, and Vivian Schiller. So thank you very much.
All right, thank you. I think this is a great segue from the last panel because with the last panel we saw some amazing examples of how you can tell stories and what the final product is. And I'm sure there's a lot of people in the room thinking, okay, yeah, well, how do I do it? I don't have an army of people. So what we want to talk a little bit about today is how do you execute those newsroom strategies? How do you get the right people? Who are the people that are involved in building these stories? And then how do you customize them and get them distributed out on the platforms? So rather than doing introductions, you can read the bios in your program. What I thought we could do is kind of go down the line and just start if everyone could describe a little bit about their newsroom today. How is it a little bit different maybe from 18 to 24 months ago? Who's there? How are you organized?
Hi, everyone. Well, I started at the Boston Globe about 12 months ago. I've been there just a year now, so I wouldn't know about 18 months ago. What I do know is that it still seems to be constantly shifting every day. The people that I'm working with vary from project to project. The questions that we ask project to project, though, remain the same, and that those questions are about how do we create audiences of empathy? How do we create products that help people understand the world that they're living in, help people ask questions of that world, and then help people participate in that world with what we're creating. As we refine our process project to project, the people that we pull in change as the stories vary, whether they're coming from our Spotlight team or our Metro desk or our Enterprise desk, those people vary too. We're still learning, we're still experimenting, and it's very much a process of experimentation at the Boston Globe right now.
Excellent. Scott.
I'm Scott Klein. I work at ProPublica. I'm here in New York. I've been there since the beginning and way back in 2008. Say in the last 12 to 18 months, I think it's the DNA of the place. Oh, that's my team. The DNA of the place, I think, is fundamentally the same, but we always change our tactics and our strategy and what we think we can do and what we really do as people join. So we're still a small enough place that one person is always making a difference and pulling us in different directions and helping us rethink the way we tell stories, the way we reach audiences, the way we think about design, the way we think about how we present our stories to users, or even what our stories are and what they're made of. So I would say that we've sort of changed a lot, and I think that in 18 months we will be doing things that I would tell you today that we would never do, or we'll be doing things that I would tell you today that we'll never figure out how to do. So we're changing all the time. Excellent. I think we probably have changed since I got here.
And Justin, we heard from your CEO this morning. What didn't he tell us?
I missed it, but I presume he probably covered everything. I could just skim over some details. So I've only been at the New York Times now for 12 months, just like Laura. Prior to that, I was at the Washington Post for 5 years. So I've actually seen 2 newsrooms change, kind of in somewhat recent days. I think for most traditional news organizations, by which I mean started publishing before the internet was more of a thing. So for me and my experience in newspapers, but I think the same is true of magazines, cable TV, broadcast TV. The traditional setup of a news organization is kind of like a federalist system. There's the centralized organism, the news desk at the Washington Post. They call it the universal news desk. And then there are kind of the states out there. There are the news desks that cover international or sports or the metro area or whatever locality they may have came from. And so that's kind of the constant rubric back there. Some of the changes at the Times in the last few months has been to kind of bring some other disciplines to the center of the room. So I work on a group called the Audience Development Team that started at the Times actually also just about a year ago or so, and we sit in the middle of the room, physically, literally, as well as spiritually in the way that we actually interact with other groups. And just like the news desk that controls what goes on A1 or thinks about the homepage or the apps or other kind of newer departments like photography, it's funny, photography is still somewhat new for a 160-year-old publication, but video, these other kind of desks that kind of float between with all those other originating news desks. Audience development kind of works like that, and the goal really is, right, to figure out what kind of tasks have to be done in a centralized room. You know, you can't have everyone sending items out on main branded accounts, otherwise every desk will be sending out all of their coverage. But you do want a certain amount of originality and creativity bubbling up from those desks, and so I think that's really a thing we keep in mind all the time at the Times, and something we're always working towards.
And Vivian, so you spent a bunch of time leading organizations through the .com era. Now you're advising companies in
Are we
kind
out
of
of it now?
the social era, and now they're merging. There's that Venn diagram of social and digital. How have you seen the response within newsrooms? Are people a little bit, were people a little bit more averse to change, and now there's more experimentation?
Yeah, I've seen a lot of change and perpetual change, and like you said, I've been on both, if you can call them sides. I mean, having been part of or run newsrooms, and then being in people's newsroom as a representative of Twitter, and now through my work, I'm sort of back in everybody's newsrooms in different capacities. I've seen sort of the good, the bad, and the ugly. And
Tell us about the ugly.
Oh, there's a lot of ugly. Well, if you push me later, I'll get into my rant about the phrase being platform agnostic and how much I hate that and how it's completely the antithesis of what people should be doing. But what I've seen,
Someone remind me.
but what's encouraging to me, I think, is that the more informed, thoughtful newsrooms are doing, along the lines of what everybody here is doing, which is, a focus on the concept of audience development, regardless of what you call it. It goes by many names, and sort of an understanding of looking at distribution not as the enemy, but as part of the ecosystem. I'm seeing much more sort of, skeptical embrace and thoughtful approaches to platforms. So that's the good thing, and I have to say I was amused about Rainey in the last panel. I don't think any journalist has ever referred to Facebook as a righteous platform. I absolutely love that. So, but there's some truth to that.
So what I want to talk a little bit about is the people in the newsroom. Gone are the days where the newsroom is just journalists. And full disclosure, I am not a journalist by trade. Everything I know, I learned from my colleagues in the AP at the past 2 years. When I came in at the end of my first week, I Googled the word slug, because I just kept hearing people talk about slugs and I had no idea what they were talking about. And at the same time, a lot of my coworkers that I was talking with, when I started talking about APIs, they kind of looked at me like I was two-headed. So now we're seeing a lot more of these teams interdisciplinary. And Scott, I wanted to start with you, because I know you have a good perspective on this. We need data scientists, we need designers, we need product people. How do we get them to all work together?
Yeah, I have a very sort of different take on this. I'm not a big believer in the concept of this sort of cross-disciplinary team. I believe, and this is very much something that I inherited from the culture at ProPublica, that everybody should be a journalist, especially in a small newsroom, or should feel empowered to do journalism and expected to do journalism and expected to take on the ethics and some of the tactics and kind of mindset of journalism. The people on my team who none of whom are traditional computer scientists, but mostly journalism majors, and I was an English major, and things like that, come to ProPublica from very different places, come from a variety of disciplines. But what I feel strongly about it is that they feel empowered to do journalism in all of their work. We make large-scale interactive databases that sort of tell stories using kind of your own data. So you can come to a ProPublica interactive database and find how a large national phenomenon relates to you and your communities. And the people who make those things are not split teams where there's one person who does back-end development and one person who does front-end development and one person who is the journalist and one person who does maybe some data management. Each project is led by one person who has an authorship over the work. So rather than being like a bunch of tourists kind of walking together, touring an art museum, we have one person who has the primary responsibility to figure out what the story is in a large database and how to express that story to people who come to it. So, does that mean that they're all gifted designers? No. Does it mean they're all amazing coders? No. Does it mean that they're all great journalists? No. But together we are these things. And we can lift each other up and help each other because we do work together. But we don't sort of split it into sort of a a industrial arrangement where we split tasks by expertise. We would much rather split tasks by project. So it's a little bit different.
Justin, is that the same way for you? How is your team comprised? And how
Yeah,
do
I mean,
you-
I would co-sign on pretty much everything Scott just said. Man, and I love the industrial analogy too. I mean, I find myself drawing on that a lot, kind of talking about how, folks who have worked in journalism for a while, it's, we all talk about disruption and change, but it's been kind of slowly happening for the better part of a generation now. At a certain point, right, there were people who sat in the courthouse and called in some news, and there was a rewrite desk, and there were spittoons around, and people with ink on their fingers, and other people would be press lettermen, and some people would have station wagons, and some people eventually had computers to design better routes for the station wagons to go on to. And it's just, you all have to do a little something to the left, a little something to the right these days. It's hopefully project-oriented. If you can have people own a project from beginning to end, there'll be a really clear thought on that. You can think about the idea, the audience you want to connect it to, and how best to tell that story or present that information. Sometimes ideas are a little more abstract, and you have to kind of pull more people in. But the idea of people not being siloed, as Scott kind of described, I think is a huge goal of ours. There's actually this amazing story. There's a biography written by a guy named Arthur Gelb, who had been a managing editor at the Times back in the 80s and 90s. He started as a copy boy in the 30s. And if you're a student of journalism, as I imagine there are some here, or even just, someone who loves journalism, you should read this biography. It's absolutely incredible. It kind of tells the story of the Times from the late 30s through the 90s, a guy who was copy editor and Metro editor and art critic and became a VP and worked on the business side. And, the guy's stories of seeing changes from things like, cold set type, the use of computers, special sections in the 70s, the introduction of color photography, which was seen as flamboyant. He tells an amazing story from early on where some like Mike Royko type columnist is dancing on a desk and telling stories of his days as a young buck reporter in the 1890s in frontier Colorado, and how the older reporters then told him, you can't use a telephone to call sources, you can't look them in the eyes and see what they're actually telling you or not. So, it's a reminder that all these newfangled things from, data science to social media to photography, they're all just different changes like they're happening for over 100 years now.
Excellent. So you both described kind of authorship over the work and in essence kind of a project manager. Is that how the role of the editor has shifted? I mean, Laura, have you seen that as well within the Globe?
Yeah, one thing that I like that Scott said was how one person has ownership of the project. And I think that one thing that I struggle with a lot is that we have a really excellent reporting team at the Boston Globe. We also have a really excellent team of photographers and a really excellent team of video journalists. The list goes on. And we love to get really excited about a story. And when we get really excited about a story, we see it in the format we know best. And so pulling all those people together, creating a singular vision and saying, this is the most appropriate way to tell this story, this is the best we can do, is among the hardest jobs we have to do right now. I don't know if you agree or not.
Oh, I absolutely agree. Yeah, no, there's no question.
You were nodding, so I assume
No,
yes.
I do. No, I agree completely. It's a tough problem, but at the same time, it's sort of one of the great opportunities, right? Because, the vision that the person has, often is expressed very, very well, right? So, sometimes it's going to take all of these things as Clay Shirky says, nothing may work, but everything might, right? So, maybe the answer is it's a story and it's a photo and it's a database and it's kind of all of these things, if you have the resources to do it. So.
And yet sometimes and so often I feel like we still leave so much of that good stuff on the floor because we have to cut it. And so I think that we're trying to find new ways to say, okay, which part of this goes for which audience then?
Sure.
And how can we segment that out?
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess that is the role of an editor. But in my view, the sort of my formulation of this, because we expect everyone in the newsroom to be a journalist, even if they don't come from a place that is traditionally journalism, or they're not doing work that feels or looks like journalism used to look. The analogs are all there. So the people who work on my team, even though their title is developer, and even though sort of what comes out of them is not words or pictures, but software, they function very much like reporters do. And my role as an editor is very much like any other editor at ProPublica, where I help them kind of sharpen their ideas. I help them, make sure that the thing that we have been talking about, that is the story that they're working on, is what is expressed in the product that comes out. I help them make sure that they're right. I help them make sure, on some level, though I'm the least qualified to do this, that their code is good, that it's performant, and that people are, it works on the devices we need it to work on. So, in my kind of a kind of narrow view of or my kind of narrow role in the newsroom, it's the same as kind of any other editor, which is to help them synthesize their ideas, sharpen their ideas, kind of make sure that they're right and things like that.
I think there's way too much agreement on this panel, so I'm
Go
going
for
to
it.
be a contrarian here and make and speak on
Thank
defense.
God.
What's that? Yeah. And speak on defensive specialization. Now, don't get me wrong. Just so I'm not going to argue in support of silos, and I'm not going to. I'm not going to argue in support of, people not pursuing, of not having people who are accountable and responsible and team effort and all that kind of thing. All good. However, I think that we're living in a very complicated age right now in our business, and there are certain specialties and certain amount of focus on areas that I think is absolutely essential. So I'll go into my rant about platform agnosticism now, which is the notion of, we have a singular vision for a story, for lack of a better word, in all of its manifestations, and we embrace all of the platforms, and therefore, create ones, publish everywhere, and we're going to push it out, and aren't we great because we're on every platform and we're telling our story in the same way everywhere. I think that is absolutely, positively the wrong way to go, and this is where the specialization comes in. And as everybody here knows, the way that the kinds of people and the ways that people engage when they're, first of all, when they're on their laptop versus when they're on their mobile phone, when they're on Facebook, whether they're on Twitter, when they're on Snapchat, whether they're lying in bed because they just woke up in the morning, whether they're on the couch, whether they're watching TV. Every single one of these use cases and platforms is radically different and requires thinking about how to penetrate people's consciousness with the story you want to tell. I thought I was really, I sat in for the last panel, and what Rainey and her team at Facebook did around that story for Syria, I think is a beautiful example of it. I mean, in the old, nobody in this room, but some other news organizations, or in the olden days, like a few years ago, a documentary unit would have taken like a clip of their documentary and put it on Facebook, as opposed to starting from scratch and going, how do people consume media? How are they telling stories? What's the mindset of looking at it on a mobile device? And how do we best get our message across? And so that requires really careful, thoughtful specialization, people that deeply understand. What I'm seeing more and more, because I'm in a lot of newsrooms all the time, is a lot of, particularly the digitally native news organizations, they are creating in their audience development script going, you are the Snapchat person, the Twitter person, the Facebook person, whatever it might be. And it's not to say that everybody else can go, I don't have to worry about Snapchat because Joe's doing it. But to be the expert and the evangelist on behalf of the platform and the users of that platform, I think is absolutely essential.
So how do you justify some of the investment there? Because you're absolutely right. All these Snapchat Discover channels, I saw Refinery 29 hired about 10 people. Vox has hired 3 or 4 people. How do you advise justification on we're going to invest in these specialists, but we don't yet necessarily know if they're going to make any money?
Well, that's absolutely true, and obviously you have to scale your business with your, to the best of your abilities, and very small organizations are not going to be able to have a team of 20. But once you get to sufficient size, there's no justification not to invest there, because, what is the point of doing your work if you're not going to be reaching the people and not growing your audience? I mean, I don't think anybody here disagrees with that. I'm not saying anything radical, but it's, look, the business, that's a whole other panel, and we can go down that road of the discussions of the monetizations on these panels. It's challenging, but I see no alternative. There's sort of death or iteration.
Right. Now, Justin, you guys have experimented with a bunch of stuff. I've seen some stuff with WhatsApp. I've seen the List app, which I'm a fan of because I'm a fan of BJ Novak, and you guys can tweet him and tell him I gave him props. But
created a good app too.
It's a really good app. So let's take that one as an example for the List app. Maybe explain for those that aren't familiar. Did you, how did you decide what kind of content would go there?
Well, it's still very much nascent. We're still figuring it out. I would hazard a guess we've been on it for a month, and we've put on 10, 15 lists, maybe more. I think we're trying to, if not every day, like somewhat regularly. And this kind of gets to Vivian's point a little bit, the specialization. You have to kind of just place your bets. The Times, with the amount of stuff that we publish, with how big our report is, and the amount of energy we put on to publishing, we can place a lot of bets. Some other organizations have to scale in kind of different directions. You still, even as big and wonderful and just the breadth of the Times, no matter, we're a huge general interest news publication, we still can't go everywhere. We have to make decisions not to. So for instance, example of the list, it just seemed like something that was going to be fairly lightweight. And, to be frank, people on our social team were excited about it, thought it was fun, and wanted to explore there. It's interesting, actually, there are certain social networks, everybody knows now, if you were on Twitter or Facebook in 2007, 2008, that worked out really well for you, right? Some people who maybe in the room in 2010 or 11 were experimenting with color. No, it's a deep social pull, but you would be less than satisfied with your investment in that platform at this point, or Friendster or MySpace, or anything like that. And when I was at the Post 2 years ago, we experimented with Yo a little bit. And again, like in a very lightweight way, one person was spending a little bit of time. Every time I think we had an NSA story come out, we would Yo the link to 500 followers or something. And it was, the truth is, it ended up obviously not driving much of an audience, but it actually helped us think a little bit about a push notification. Now, nothing about the words you would write in a push notification, but the timing of it, thinking through what is push, and that has, so even though that was, you could say, a waste of time, because I don't know how many people are still using Yo, I don't mean to offend any hardcore Yo fans, but there still was a value to doing that for a little while, and then porting that into Facebook Notify right now, or to native app pushes.
I think that's a good segue where I wanted to go next. How do you decide when to pull the plug? I am, don't get me wrong, I am 100% a fan of experimentation and rapid prototyping. And I think that's probably the thing that the journalism industry could learn the most from the tech world, of just really failing fast and iterating. But how do you decide that in an industry of journalism where perfection is the ultimate goal, making sure that you're unimpeachable? How do you get that culture of let's experiment, let's fail fast, and when we realize that something isn't going well, let's pull the plug and move on? Have any of you had success or struggles with that?
I'm going to give props to the Times on this. Sorry, I know I'm here representing
No,
New York
I'll listen
Times,
to that
but-
all day long.
Yeah. First of all, it's really tough. The stop doing is so hard because, people fall in love with their products and, we just give it a little more time. It didn't get enough promotion, or why don't we do this? The Times has actually, I have to say, been pretty good about being kind of ruthless. The most, notable. I mean,
In a
a
gentle
lot of
way.
examples. What's that?
In a gentle way.
Yes. Yes, in a righteous way. That's the word of this conference, I think. For example, I've already forgotten the name of it. Shows how much. But the mobile app that was created around the opinion section. Yeah. It wasn't working. It clearly wasn't working. There weren't. I mean, I don't know. I wasn't on the inside, but clearly it was so far off whatever expectations there were that you could have just piled on, put good money after bad, or said, you know what, this is a bad idea. Let's just stop doing it and let's deploy our energies. And I've seen that over the years, from when I was there till now, over the years of things that everybody fell in love with, it just wouldn't work. And as hard it is, just pull the club. Times People. I don't know if anybody remembers Times People. It's a big deal. It took over the top of the. What's that?
Time Select as well.
Oh, well, yes, thank you. That was me killing that one.
It's a good choice.
So I think the Times has done a good job on that.
Excellent. Anyone either at the Globe or ProPublica? Scott, I know your pieces are huge and they're beautiful. Do you ever get to the point kind of partway through where you've invested a ton of resource and just say, that's not working?
No,
No?
we fall in love. No,
Excellent.
yeah. In fact, it's sort of a significant challenge on my team. We make these durable resources where these databases are often not trivial but straightforward to keep up to date over time, and we have debates within the team which ones are worth continuing to invest in, which aren't. So it's a continual learning process. But in terms of the product development at ProPublica, I think probably that's something we struggle with as anyone else. I mean, especially as a small organization, it's sometimes you're not sure, is it us or is it it?
Right.
Yeah.
And so, Laura, if you want to tell us a little bit maybe about Homicide Watch as well.
Mm-hmm.
And you kind of incorporated your own product in development.
Mm-hmm.
And how do you see it work? What would you do differently today?
Good question. It's hard to believe. I was thinking about it this morning. Homicide Watch is now 5 years old, which is really hard to believe. We started in DC in 2010. The Homicide Watch DC site is no longer publishing. Homicide Watch is publishing, though, today in Chicago in partnership with the Sun-Times, Trenton with the Trentonian, and Boston with Northeastern University. One thing that I wanted to do to further the platform before taking the job at the Globe was create some sort of open platform for it. If anybody's familiar with the platform SeeClickFix, for example, whether there was a way to bring the community into the time-consuming process of reporting homicides. One of the things that makes Homicide Watch work so well is the community that gathers around it. That it's the comments, it's the submission of photos, it's the submission of tips and information that really makes it tick. On all of our sites, we've had a reporter or editor who's in the middle of that process, writing stories, putting the information into the database, updating the photo. And I always wondered what would happen if we opened that process up some more and said, here's a platform, what would you like to do with it next? That would solve a lot of problems for a lot of communities that wanted to adopt Homicide Watch, but didn't have a news organization that wanted to run it. Is that something that we would do differently? I don't know. I think that we've learned a lot from starting the process with having a reporter and editor there in charge, and that was necessary in order to help determine what the questions were that we wanted to answer. But there are a lot of new places that a community could take it in an open platform.
And how have you seen some of the parallels between running your own site and then working at the Globe and some of the projects you take on there?
I think that I've brought into the Boston Globe a very mission-driven process. And what made Homicide Watch work for me is that I was able to take a very simple question, who's being impacted by homicide, and ask a follow-up question, what would they like to see happen next? How do they understand the process of criminal justice? And take those questions to the Boston Globe, where we have a larger team of people to answer those questions. I think that we're seeing Clash in the Name of Care right here. This is a project that was just out from our Spotlight team a couple weeks ago while I was on leave, so I can't take credit for large sections of this project, which is really incredible. It's about concurrent surgeries and surgeons at Massachusetts General Hospital who are in multiple operating rooms at the same time, working on multiple patients. One of the questions that we tried to answer with this project is, if I'm reading this story, I have a surgery booked, my mother has a surgery booked, my son has a surgery booked, where do I fall in this story? What does the next paragraph need to tell me? What conversation do I want to have with the reporter? And so we created very clear comments forms for this story where people were able to very easily then share their information and ask the follow-up questions that they had as they're going through. I think that's an approach that Homicide Watch taught me, of where's the community in this story and who are we targeting with this story, what do we need from them, and what do they need from us.
So taking that kind of the community approach of really understanding your audience, and Vivian, you were talking about having a very dedicated focus on each of these platforms. What are some of tactically, what are some of the training that you've implemented to really tell stories on these platforms? I haven't looked at the time style guide lately, but I can't imagine there's probably a whole lot about emoji in there. But it's going to pop up on a lot of these things. So how do you all kind of blend the old journalistic integrity with the new storytelling platform? We can start with you since I called the times out.
I guess, always emerging, always changing, the usual, I guess, it's kind of funny to reflect on it and think how much is still ahead of us in a lot of ways. And I think that's the way that we kind of help make it easier to make the process happen. To say, look, it's not as if we're going to a destination right now. Like, here's the answer. You tweet like this. You post to Facebook like that. You check out 3 new social networks every 4 months, and one will survive, and that's the end of it. So it's really actually nice in 2015 to be able to walk into a newsroom and have a certain amount of skepticism, have a certain amount of experience, collectively as well as individually, and be able to say to people at different ranges and levels of, on the spectrum of interest and, and applicability to their jobs, here's where we are, here's where we're going. We all know we're in a moment of disruption. We all know we're in a moment of change. Here's what that means for you. So it actually kind of makes it easy to adapt it to all these different audiences within the newsroom to think about. I guess, real specifically what I'll say is just constant trainings, constant brown bags and, one-on-one sessions and working lunches and digital universities. I spent 5 years at the Post, and I'd say every 6 months there was some brand new kind of thing we would do. And by the end, I think we got an understanding of we're not going to rewrite the curriculums every single time. We're just going to look from our shared experience and kind of adapt forward. And I feel very fortunate at the Times to be there at a time of giant change, being able to take advantage of so much other change throughout the rest of the industry, and just beg, borrow, steal from everything you're seeing from the best of your competitors.
Excellent. At ProPublica, one of the things that we've learned from sort of hard experience is that it's not just training, it's also kind of getting into the process early enough and asking questions early enough in the life cycle of a story. So we have thought a lot and kind of tried to hatch schemes to do things differently with a given project. We say, hey, what if this wasn't a story? What if this weren't a long-form story, but were instead some more immersive technique or some different way of doing it, or taking advantage of other kinds of platforms? And we have found that there's actually a precise moment when you can have this conversation, after which sort of hearts get set on, but I have to vindicate my sources, and I want to start with this anecdote, and reporters start sort of seeing, envisioning the story a certain way. And it's very, very difficult, no matter kind of how much you convince them that the audience is over here instead of over there, it's very hard to kind of get their heart into doing it a different way. Whereas if you get it at the right moment, they're very open to it. And if it's too early, it's not really time yet to have that conversation. You don't really know what you have and whether it can kind of fit into a new way of doing things. So for us, it's not just about training. It's not just about having conversations, because it's a very open and very friendly newsroom. It's also kind of finding that exact moment when the story is ripe, but it's not yet set.
Mm-hmm. And I think, a lot of the trend that we're seeing is curation newsrooms, and a lot of the digital pure plays are kind of pulling bits and pieces from everywhere. Vivian, having spent time at Twitter, does that make you nervous at all? Because I think when you're pulling stuff from a Reddit source or a 4chan source, or maybe an unvetted Twitter source, you're going to get a lot of wrong information proliferating.
Right. Well, when I preached that myself when I was at Twitter. I've believed it my whole life. The actual principles of information sharing with the public, information that happens to be true, is sort of one of the core principles, right, of journalism, I think. And at Twitter, what we would do, and they still do, and I still believe in, is, Twitter is a massive tip network, right? So you can't. There's absolutely no possible way to verify that any specific tweet anywhere on Twitter among the 500 million tweets a day is true. If somebody's got a blue check mark, you can know they are who they say they are, which still doesn't necessarily mean what they've tweeted is true. So, Twitter, when we were there, and hopefully they still are, very careful to say, you cannot necessarily, here's how you use Twitter to find, clusters of information, trends, breaking news, and then here's how you use Twitter as a tool to verify that information, and that with these tools, we can get you all the way to the last mile, and then the last mile is in the hands of the journalist in the same ways that stories have been sourced and vetted and verified in time immemorial, or maybe not in time immemorial, because now we have telephones and things like that. But it's it's an incredible resource, but it can't be taken at face value.
Does the platform have a responsibility? That came up in a couple of the conversations earlier today.
No. The core Twitter product, as your timeline, I believe has no responsibility whatsoever. It's a free speech platform, so people are going to lie. People lie all the time. Now, when you start getting into curated products and things like Twitter Moments, that's an entirely different ball game. And I think Twitter has a responsibility that if they're going to touch it, as soon as you touch it, you own it. So something like Twitter Moments, this is a big risk factor, I think. And I'm sure that it will happen just like any of these platforms have happened. Look, CNN's been in the news today because they're shutting down iReport, and in recognition of the fact that there are now these powerful other ways for people to share information like Facebook and Twitter. But they were hamstrung at the beginning by having their name on things that were, that they had a light touch of vetting on that turned out to not be true. It's either just a pure feed, or you have to take on the responsibility of verifying. There's no in between.
Right. Does anyone want to disagree? Yeah, I didn't think so, but I was giving the opportunity
Yeah,
for
yeah,
some
yeah.
adversarialness. So I've been asked to make sure that we get the research question in. So we're going to hit the research question, and it looks like we'll have a couple of minutes for questions. So if anybody wants to line up at the mic, we'll take those in a couple of minutes. So out of everything that we've talked about today, everything on this panel, what are some of the research things that Tao should take into account moving forward? And I'll let anybody start. What are some of the research ideas that emerge that you would like to see the Tao Center take on?
Good question.
I've been, given the sort of nature of the work that I do and the needs that I have and the things that stare at me right now, I would love to know ways in which traditional academic researchers can learn from and help inform the role of journalism. So, we do a lot of things on my team and at ProPublica that feel a lot like academic research. They come from very different places. They have very different outputs, very different timelines, very different metabolisms, but they seem a lot like academia. We write white papers for our most complex statistical analyses. We don't put them through a peer review process because we can't really be open with what we're working on until we publish, and for all sorts of other reasons. And I would be kind of curious to see, to have somebody smarter than me take a look at that and help us think about that and see what opportunities there are and kind of what risks we're running by doing it the way we do it. I think there are times in which we are reinventing the wheel at ProPublica. We are kind of making up techniques that, in fact, a lot of academics have been using for years. Researchers, scientists kind of have known how to use for years. And I'd be kind of curious to see if we could get a Mark Hansen or somebody to come and see what we do and say, "Why, my God, why are you doing it that way?" There's 16 researchers who can help you do this in 10 minutes. So that would be great. Okay.
A good friend of mine, Neiman colleague, Karim Ben Khalifa, has a new project that he's been working on called The Enemy. It is a true virtual reality project. You wear goggles and motion sensors, and it is among the most amazing things I've ever seen in the world. I just saw it this past weekend. On one side of the room is a true-to-life looking person on one side of a conflict. On the other side is a true-to-life looking person from the other side of the conflict. And they have been filmed answering questions about who they believe their enemy is. The spaces we create as journalists and the spaces we occupy as members of the community, I think, are fascinating. I thought about that a lot with Homicide Watch. I think about it a lot with the projects that I create at the Boston Globe. Kareem's project on The Enemy, creating a true virtual space to walk around, to be in, and to feel emotions and empathy in, I think is really the next question for me in terms of what we want people to do in the spaces we create, how we invite them in, and how we then create the architecture to welcome that interaction.
I might actually answer by trying to tie something that Laura just said with something that Vivian's been saying. And I don't know if Mark talked about this morning. I'd imagine he might have. We, we recently put out a memo or a strategy statement from the Times saying that I think it's called the Path Forward, and just the idea of being here's where our digital revenue is now, here's where we want to be in 2020, and it really kind of just lays down a few markers of what we think of ourselves as a subscription business. And as part of that, there's a lot of the buzzword habituation going around the building, and I think habituation is another, it's a more technocratic word for empathy, for connection, for just creating a relationship with your audience where they care about what you do, and eventually they hopefully give you money for what you do. And I think to tether to kind of what Vivian's saying about platforms and specialization, we're spending a lot of time at the Times figuring out what habituation means for us, and the way people interact with our homepage, with our print product, with our apps. We're obviously concerned with our social presence as well, but I think research that can be done in the general space of the Times, and I love it, but we are a very weird animal. We are a big spaceship with lots of coverage all over the place. We cover conflicts, we cover the Mets, we cover science, we cover all sorts of disparate issues, and a lot of publishers can either be more niche-y or kind of cover thinner slices or just deeper into certain wells. But the ability to kind of understand in social networks how you create that habituation back to your presence, whether it's on that network or back to your own platform, could be really powerful.
I don't know if this is research, a research project per se, but it's on my mind because I just, prior to this, came from having lunch with a guy that's running the Connected Media program that's part of the new Cornell Technion program. And it's so interesting because the kind of challenges that he's talking about, his program, which is sort of starts from, to them, the media in connected media is little m. What we're talking about is media big M. Same word, two different meetings. And I wonder if, some of the things he was talking about is how can his program, which comes in through the little m, get more connected to the big M? And sorry if I'm completely losing everybody with the little m, big
You're
M,
good.
but okay. But this is a program that's more about big M, and how do we connect it to the little m so that we can, bring together people that understand sort of, connected media and come from a technology perspective and get them to feel the civic responsibility that journalists feel, have journalists and connect them to people that are more involved with technology and bring it together to solve the world's problems, frankly. So that's what I'd like to see more of.
Thank you. And so we have a question?
Yes, I was wondering with all the discussion on platforms and apps, whether there's a consolidated list that ranks them as far as, Facebook down to Yo, what's their reach, what are their demographics, what are their efficacies, what are their unique characteristics, what's their shelf life? So does an app or a platform come on the scene and it seems to have a lot of power and a lot of trend, and then it's gone in a month? Is there a consolidated list like that out?
I'll just say my glib answer, and then I'll let somebody to answer it more seriously, is there is a very specific ranked list, and the first 10 platforms on the list are all Facebook.
It's not terribly far off, yeah. I mean, the other version of that answer is just, yeah, I mean, it's codified a little bit. Facebook and Twitter are these giant platforms. But, Snapchat wasn't what it is today, which is massive. It wasn't 3-4 years ago. So, I just would place your bets and be aware of the fact that a few emerge. It's great to play in other spaces and learn, and some will emerge to something else. But it's pretty tough to break through the top. I mean, there's a reason why Facebook and Twitter and Google acquire all those really smart startups. It's to kind of bring them into their universe.
Who consolidates the list? Where can we access the list?
Honestly, Alexa.com.
Maybe. I think there's, I straddled both sides of the coin because I think sometimes there's a little bit of bright and shiny syndrome where it's like, oh, that's new, that's cool, let me go use that. But at the same time, if you don't go and practice with that sort of stuff, you may run the risk of being the laggard and being the last one to adopt Snapchat or being the last one to adopt Twitter and being behind the 8 ball. So I think even those folks down at the bottom of the list, you got to play a little bit, at least just to understand them.
And if you're international, it's a different list in other countries too.
Yeah.
It's still Facebook in every country, I suspect, but China has a whole completely separate ecosystem of those systems. So the sad news is there is no list consolidated or otherwise.
Does that make that a research question?
Oh, sure. Unfortunately, the list would also change every 18 weeks. So.
Keep you employed that way.
Yeah.
So we are unfortunately out of time, so I just want to thank my panelists and thank you all.